try and picture a library, but erase the image of books and quiet reading rooms and librarians shushing you from your head.
Right, replace all of that with a massive cavernous space. The locals in Calcutta actually used to call it the Jadugar.
Which translates, I think, literally to the House of Mysteries, right? Or Magic's House.
The Mysteries.
I love that. But instead of novels or encyclopedias, the shelves here are lined with millions, I mean literally millions of glass jars.
Just endless rows of them.
Exactly. Some have preserved skins, others have fossilized bones, some just have these bizarre creatures floating in yellowish liquid. It is essentially a library that holds the biological history of an entire subcontinent.
From the tiniest microscopic amoeba all the way up to
the skeleton of a massive blue whale suspended from the ceiling.
It really sounds like the setting of a fantasy novel. Or maybe a slightly creepy horror movie, depending on how you feel about spiders and snakes.
Definitely creeping horror for me.
But we are actually talking about a very real, very crucial government institution. The Zoological Survey of India, or the ZSI.
Right, so today we are cracking open the archives for this deep dive. Specifically, we've got the history and progress reports spanning from 1916 all the way to 1990.
And accounts from their centennial celebrations, too.
Yes, those two. We are going to find out how this institution became the self-proclaimed guardian of the National Zoological Collections. And honestly, it is a much wilder ride than you would ever expect from a government department.
It really is. I mean, when you think government survey, you think paperwork in triplicate. You do not think adventure.
Exactly. But in these files, we've got world wars, catastrophic floods, deep-sea exploration, and I still cannot believe this is in the official records, a government-sanctioned hunt for the abominable snowman.
It is a totally fascinating history. But before we get carried away with the...
Oh, we will get there.
We definitely will. But I think it is important to set the stakes early on for you listening. This deep dive isn't just about hoarding dead bugs in a dusty basement. The story of the ZSI is really the story of how modern India learned to understand its own environment.
It's a story about survival, really.
Yes. Surviving wars, surviving the transition of an entire empire, and ultimately ensuring the survival of the biodiversity that keeps the country's agriculture and health systems running.
So let's unpack this. The ZSI officially celebrates its birthday on July 1st, 1916. That is the official stamp date on the paperwork. But the roots go way deeper than that, don't they?
They do. If you really want to understand the DNA of the ZSI, you have to go back to the late 18th century. We are talking about the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which was founded in 1784 by Sir William Jones.
This was the era of the gentleman scholar, right? Pith helmets and cabinets of curiosity.
Exactly. It was the absolute peak of that era. You had army officers, doctors, colonial administrators who were just entirely obsessed with the natural world. People like Edward Blythe or Godwin Austen.
Names that are still huge in biology today.
Right. And they were collecting everything they could get their hands on. Birds, reptiles, mollusks, butterflies. And they were donating these massive private collections to the Asiatic Society.
Just giving them away?
Mostly, yes. It was about prestige, it was about discovery and documenting the East. By 1875, these collections had grown so large, they were moved into the new Indian Museum in Calcutta. But there is another origin story here that I find even more compelling than the wealthy collectors.
Oh, the investigator.
Yes, the story of the investigator.
I saw this in the notes and I really wanted to dig into it. The Royal Indian Marine Survey ship, the investigator.
Yeah.
It sounds like something straight out of a Jules Verne book.
It really wasn't far off from that. This ship was active from 1884 to 1926. And you have to understand, in the late 19th century, marine biology was barely a thing. It was in its infancy. Most people thought the deep ocean was just this barren wasteland where nothing could possibly survive.
But the investigator was out there proving them wrong.
It was a floating laboratory. It was dredging the deep waters of the Bay of Bengal, pulling up creatures from the abyss that literally no human being had ever laid eyes on before.
So before the ZSI even technically existed on paper, they were already doing cutting-edge deep-sea exploration.
Precisely. They were hauling up nets full of mud and finding bioluminescent fish, strange crustaceans, creatures adapted to crushing pressures. It laid the absolute foundation for marine biology in India.
That is incredible.
So by the time 1916 rolls around and the government decides to create the ZSI as a standalone department, they are not starting from scratch. They are inheriting this unbelievable backlog of data and specimens.
And they handed the keys to the first director, Dr. T.N. Annandale. Now, usually when I picture a director of a government survey in 1916, I picture a guy with a monocle stamping papers and making sure the pencils are sharpened. But Annandale seems, well, different.
He was a true visionary. Annandale realized that just displaying animals, putting a stuffed tiger in a glass case for people to gawk at, wasn't science. It was spectacle.
He wanted to understand their ecology.
Right. Their environment, their context, their behavior. He pushed the survey to go beyond taxonomy. Taxonomy is just naming things. He wanted true biological science.
And he was an anthropologist too, wasn't he?
He was. So he understood the connection between people and nature. He wanted to know how the fish lived in the river, not just what the fish looked like pinned to a table.
But as we know, history had some serious turbulence in store for his vision.
That is putting it mildly.
This is where the story shifts from a science adventure to a full-on disaster movie. Fast forward to 1942, World War II is raging.
And Kolkata was a major target. The threat of Japanese aerial bombing was very, very real. The government started to panic.
Not just about the people, but about these collections.
Exactly. You have to remember, these aren't just souvenirs. They are scientific standards. If a bomb hits that museum, centuries of data vanish in a fireball.
So they decide to evacuate, which sounds completely sensible. Get the precious cargo out of the city.
It was the only choice they had. They packed up the ZSI, the massive library, the specimens, the scientists themselves, and moved them inland to Varanasi, which was also known as Benares.
And they set up shop in a building called Kaiser Castle on the banks of the Varuna River. I have to say, Kaiser Castle sounds incredibly secure. It sounds fortified, like a place where you would ride out the apocalypse.
It probably felt that way to them, too.
Yeah.
Until September 1943.
The Great Flood.
It was a tragedy of ironies. They fled the fire of war only to face the water. The Varuna River started rising, and it just didn't stop.
Wow.
Water breached the compound of Kaiser Castle. It entered the cellars where they had stored the absolute most fragile, flammable things they owned. 42 racks of spirit-preserved specimens.
Just so you listening can understand the scale here, we are talking about thousands of glass bottles filled with alcohol and rare animals, right?
Exactly. Highly flammable alcohol.
Yeah.
And the water rose to ceiling height. It was chaotic. You have to imagine the scene. It is dark. The water is murky. Glass is breaking everywhere.
And you have these scientists and staff members risking their own safety, wading and swimming through floodwaters in a dark cellar.
Wait, they were actually swimming in it.
They were. Imagine the smell. River mud mixed with broken bottles of preservative spirits and decaying specimens. It must have been completely overwhelming. Why do that? What were they trying to grab in the dark?
Floating bottles and wet labels.
Labels. They were risking their lives for paper labels.
I know it sounds crazy, but yes. A specimen without a label is just a dead thing in a jar. It loses almost all its scientific value instantly.
Because you don't have the context anymore.
Exactly. If you don't know where it was found, when it was found, and by whom, it is useless for research. It just becomes a morbid decoration. So they were frantically trying to save the data, catching floating labels before they dissolved or washed away completely.
That is dedication. That is loving your job to a degree I can barely comprehend.
But it gets better. While they lost a lot, many glass bottles smashed against each other or just sank into the mud, they managed to save the most critical items of all. The type specimens. These had actually just been brought down from Dehradun.
I want to put a pin in that term, type specimen, because it pops up constantly in these reports, and we need to explain that properly later. But the fact that they saved them, that is the real miracle here.
It is. And despite the flood, despite the war raging on, the ZSI kept working. They showed this incredible resilience. They dried out the labels, rebottled what they could, and just kept publishing papers.
And that resilience was crucial because just a few years later, in 1947, India gains independence.
Right. And suddenly the ZSI isn't just a colonial hangover anymore. It has a brand new job.
Nation building.
Correct. The focus shifts entirely. It is not just what is this animal anymore. It becomes how does this animal affect our new nation?
And this brings us to Dr. S.L. Hora.
A total legend in the field. He took over as director after independence. He was an ichthyologist, a fish expert.
Which seems incredibly specific for a guy running a massive national survey. Why a fish guy?
Well, academically, he is famous for the Satapura hypothesis, which used the distribution of fish to understand the geological history of India's mountains. It is brilliant science about how mountains actually formed over millions of years.
But in 1947, the government didn't just need geological history, they needed food.
Exactly. A new nation needs to feed its people. So Dr. Hoare's work on fish became vital for the development of fisheries. He was bridging the gap between pure science and applied science.
Because if you understand fish ecology, you can catch more fish.
Or farm them better, exactly.
And it wasn't just food either. I was actually really surprised to see how much the ZSI worked on public health during this era. They weren't just out there looking for rare tigers, they were looking at snails.
Snails?
Yeah, the reports talk a lot about snails.
Right, the freshwater mollusks. Specifically, they were surveying them to see if they were carriers for schistosomiasis.
Which is a pretty nasty parasitic disease.
Extremely nasty. There was a real fear that soldiers returning from World War II and other conflicts might introduce it to India.
So the ZSI is basically acting as a biodefense line here.
In a way, yes. They were mapping the potential vectors of disease, and then you have the locusts.
The desert locust. I've seen footage of those swarms. It is terrifying. It looks like a dark cloud that just eats everything in its path.
It is an absolute nightmare for agriculture. The ZSI's work on the population dynamics of these insects was directly linked to food security.
Because if you can predict a swarm or understand their breeding cycle, you can prevent a famine.
Exactly. So you see this massive shift from collecting curiosities in the 1800s to solving vital national problems in the 1950s.
So on one hand, you have them doing this very practical, gritty, work-saving crops, stopping disease, feeding the nation. And on the other hand, in 1954, they go hunting for the Yeti.
I love this detail so much. It sticks out like a sore thumb in the official reports, doesn't it?
I honestly had to double-check that this was real. The Daily Mail, the British newspaper, organized a Himalayan expedition to Nepal to find the abominable snowman, and the ZSI sent a scientist.
They really did. And look, we can laugh about it now because we know they didn't find a Yeti.
Spoiler alert for anyone hoping for a different ending to that story.
But, and this is the scientist in me talking here, that doesn't mean the trip was a failure. You have to understand, Nepal was very difficult to access for researchers at the time. It was politically closed off in many ways.
So the Yeti was basically the ticket in.
Exactly. If a newspaper wants to pay for an expedition to a remote, high-altitude ecosystem, you go. You take the ticket. And while looking for the myth, they found reality.
They discovered rare, high-altitude birds.
And they collected the rare egg-eating snake, Helicystodon.
Helicystodon, that sounds almost as cool as a Yeti.
Almost. But it really highlights their curiosity. They were willing to investigate myths alongside hard science. It shows a breadth of vision. They weren't smums about where the funding came from. They just wanted the data.
As the decades went on, that desire for data had to physically expand, right? I mean, India is huge. It is remarkably diverse. You cannot study the desert ecology of Rajasthan from a desk in humid Calcutta.
You really can't. And this is where the regional stations come in. Under the government's 5-year plans, they started setting up outposts. Shillong for the eastern region, Pune for the western, Jabalpur for central, Jodhpur for the desert.
Dehradun for the north, Madras for the south.
Right. The logic was incredibly simple. You need boots on the ground. You need scientists living in the actual ecosystem they're studying.
It makes perfect sense. If you want to study the desert, you should probably be hot and sandy.
Exactly. And that local presence led to some major conservation wins.
The story of Silent Valley really stood out to me as a huge turning point in the ZSI's history.
Oh, this is a big one. Let's talk about Silent Valley.
That is a pivotal moment in Indian environmental history. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was a major proposal to build a massive hydroelectric dam that would have completely flooded Silent Valley in Kerala. And for you listening who might not know, Silent Valley isn't just any forest.
No, it is one of the last untouched tracts of tropical rainforest in the entire country. It is millions of years old. It is a vital genetic reservoir.
But usually in that era, and honestly, often still today, Development 1, if the government wanted a dam for electricity, they got a dam.
Usually, yes. But the ZSI conducted a comprehensive bioecological survey of the area. They went in and cataloged absolutely everything.
And their report detailed the unique fauna species that existed nowhere else on Earth that would be completely wiped out if that dam was built.
So they provided the hard data, the ammunition for the activists?
Exactly. That data was a key weapon for the conservation movement. The project was eventually scrapped. It was a clear case of the ZSI moving from just collecting animals to actively protecting them.
They weren't just observers anymore. They were defenders.
And they did similar work for the Great Nicobar Expedition in '66, the Asiatic Lion in the Gir Forest, and the Golden Langur in Assam. They were basically writing the inventory of what needed to be saved.
Which brings us perfectly back to that library of life concept you started with. By 1966, the ZSI collection had officially crossed the 1 million mark.
1 million specimens, that is a lot of jars.
It is immense, and this is where we really need to circle back and define that term type specimen properly. We mentioned they saved them from the flood, but why are they so special?
Right, because to the average person, one preserved frog looks a whole lot like another preserved frog. Why is this specific frog in this specific jar worth risking your life in floodwaters for?
Okay, let's break it down. Imagine you are a scientist, and you discover a brand new species. Let's say a new species of frog in the Western Ghats. You write a paper describing it, you say it's green, it has spots, it chirps like a cricket.
But words aren't enough.
Exactly. Words are never enough in biology. You have to designate one single physical specimen as the type. That specific dead frog in that specific jar becomes the physical definition of the species for the entire world.
It's the gold standard, like that platinum bar in Paris that used to define exactly what a kilogram was.
That is the perfect analogy. It is the ultimate reference point. If 50 years later, someone finds a frog and isn't sure if it's the same species, they have to compare it to the type.
And the ZSI holds thousands of these.
Thousands. If those were lost in that flood in 1943, we would have lost the scientific definition of those species forever. It would be absolute chaos for taxonomy. We literally wouldn't know what was what.
That puts the swimming through dark floodwaters rescue in a whole new perspective. It wasn't just sentimental. It was maintaining the scientific record for the entire planet.
And that record informs real policy today. The ZSI is responsible for compiling the red data books.
Those are the official government lists of endangered mammals, birds, and reptiles, right?
Yes. When the government decides to create a protected area or ban the hunting of a certain animal, they are very often acting on data that came directly from ZSI surveys.
Eventually, they did outgrow their scattered, rented offices. In 1987, they moved into a new high-rise headquarters in New Alipur called Pranivigyan Bhawan.
A very much-needed modernization. It ended the era of renting cramped houses and finally gave the National Zoological Collections a proper, secure home. No more flooding basements, hopefully.
So what does this all mean for us today? We have gone from a house of mysteries in the 1800s to a massive modern institute conducting complex environmental impact assessments.
I think the soul of the institution is actually best captured in a dedication found in one of their history books. It reads, "Dedicated to the animal we never catch. It's those we miss that lure us back again."
The animal we never catch. I love that. It sounds almost poetic for a dry scientific manual.
It symbolizes the never-ending quest for knowledge. Science is never truly finished. There is always something hiding in the deep sea or in the canopy of the rainforest or even in our own backyards that we just haven't found yet.
It captures the humility of science. No matter how many millions of jars we fill, there's always more to learn. But I have to play devil's advocate for you listening here. Why should you care about this century-old institution? We have Wikipedia. We have the Discovery Channel. We have stunning 4K nature documentaries.
Because every time a species is protected in India, every time an agricultural pest is successfully managed without destroying the crop, and every time we understand a little bit more about how our ecosystem functions, this institution played a role.
They are the silent accountants of India's natural wealth.
You can't manage what you don't measure. And the ZSI has been measuring for well over 100 years.
It really makes you appreciate the scale of it. From the Asiatic Society to the Yeti hunt to saving the Silent Valley, it's a continuous thread running through India's modern history.
Absolutely. And it is a thread that connects us directly to the future, too.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to chew on. We live in an age of DNA sequencing and vast digital databases. We can store the entire genetic code of an animal on a tiny hard drive. So do we really still need shelves full of dead things in jars? Why do these physical collections still matter in 2026?
That is the big question museums everywhere are facing right now. But think about this. We can extract DNA from those century-old specimens today. That is technology Annandale couldn't have even dreamed of in 1916.
We can trace how pathogens have changed over decades.
Or how body sizes have shifted due to climate change just by looking at those old jars.
So they are basically time capsules.
They are. They are a physical record of the past that we can interrogate with brand new tools. Who knows what future technologies will unlock secrets from those exact same jars 100 years from now.
It's a library where we haven't even learned how to read all the books yet.
Beautifully put.
That is it for this deep dive into the guardian of India's wildlife. Thanks for listening.